Australia people understand that there are challenges for housing affordability, that there are young people in particular trying to buy their first home and finding it harder and harder. All around Australia there are parents and grandparents who are wondering how their children are going to get into the housing market and have the sort of security that they have had through their lives. All around Australia people understand that, except in that chair, except for the Prime Minister of Australia and those who sit behind him, because they don't seem to understand that at all, Mr Speaker. They seem to treat this matter with contempt. What we see, Mr Speaker, is a government which completely does not understand housing affordability and does not have a plan to deal with it. Now, it started before the last election. I recall the debate between the former Treasurer, the member for North Sydney, when he was Shadow Treasurer, and myself when I was Treasurer in the lead-up to the last election. It was a Q&A debate, and the then Shadow Treasurer was asked about housing affordability. He got into full bluster mode, full hockey bluster. You remember what that was like? That was quite a sight to behold. He said, "I have some plans on that, on housing affordability, which we will be talking about before the election." He meant the last election. And what followed was tumbleweeds. Not a word about housing affordability. And it's been tumbleweeds ever since, Mr Speaker, except that, of course, this government has form when it comes to housing affordability. While on the topic of the former Treasurer, the member for North Sydney, remember his great contribution to the housing affordability debate. Firstly, he denied that it existed because he said if housing were unaffordable in Sydney, no one would be buying it. He declared it not a problem by Treasurer's edict, that housing affordability wasn't a problem because some people were buying houses. And then, of course, he went on to say the answer to housing affordability was to get a good job, which the dentists and the people who are all working hard across Australia, all the nurses and the teachers and everybody thought, oh, that's good advice, hadn't thought of that. Go get a better job, hadn't thought of that. But then, of course, we had the wonderful contribution from the former Treasurer suggesting that young people access their superannuation to buy their first home, which had the obvious impact of driving up the price of housing at the same time as driving down the retirement incomes of Australians. So bad was that idea, it was dropped within an hour. And of course, it goes on. The government's cut funding from the National Rental Affordability Scheme, axed the Help for Seniors program, abolished the National Affordable Housing Council and abolished the Supply Council, and of course cut funding to Homelessness Australia. Of course, the Liberals just don't get it. They don't get that the government of Australia is looked to by Australia's young people in particular for assistance when it comes to housing affordability. And then, of course, the new Prime Minister came in. And, of course, there was a sense of relief around the country. People said, oh, glad that there's a new Prime Minister. He might be able to have a sensible conversation about some of these big issues. He might be able to make a big difference on some of the challenges facing the nation, like housing affordability. And yet what we see is the Prime Minister, now Prime Minister, refusing to do so, instead engaging in a scare campaign and doing so in a condescending fashion. Just yesterday, the Prime Minister was asked about housing affordability. A journalist asked the Prime Minister just about negative gearing and housing affordability. Do you have a message? This is a very important point. Do you have a message to young people who don't have parents who can act as a guarantor on a mortgage, who can't afford a deposit of, say, $100,000 and probably face the prospect of renting for the rest of their lives and only ever see housing going up in the capital cities? Do you have a recommendation for what those young people can do? So there's an opportunity for the Prime Minister to send a message to those young people, to talk directly to those Australian citizens about his plans for housing affordability, about how he understands the challenges and their problems. And he said this, look, let me just say this to you. The Labor Party's policy on negative gearing and capital gains tax are calculated to lower the value of Australia's homes. Not an idea, not a plan, not a bit of vision, not even a bit of empathy for Australia's young people, but a scare campaign. And it gets worse because the journalist pulled him up and said, but young people can't afford homes. And he said, this is his answer. Turning to capital gains tax, let's just consider this. And he goes on with the rest of the scare campaign. Two opportunities to send a message to Australians concerned about housing affordability, he sends a message, all right. The message is, I don't care. I'm indebted to the member for Griffith, who said on national television that the Prime Minister could condescend for Australia. Well, there was an example of it, condescending to Australia's young people, saying to Australia's young people that he doesn't care about their opportunity to get a house. He doesn't care about their opportunity to get into the housing market. We hear a lot about aspiration from those opposite. We hear about how they embrace aspiration. Well, how about the aspirations of young people to own a home? How about the aspirations of young people to actually build their wealth through their house? One house, Mr Speaker. One house would do it. That's what they want to start with, to get into the housing market. Of course, all they have is condescension and a lack of a plan. We're told, of course, they've taken decisive action on housing affordability, on the matter of foreign investment, because what they've done is they've told the owner of a $39 million mansion in Point Piper that he must vacate the premises. Well, I was deluged by people in my electorate saying, thank goodness, I can now afford a house. I can now get that $39 million mansion in Point Piper. That's housing affordability for me, people in my electorate said, and the electorate of all my colleagues. They were so grateful to the Prime Minister for that decisive action on housing affordability. But we on this side of the House recognise the challenge. We recognise the problem. Since the 1980s and 90s, ownership rates have fallen, and the largest decline is amongst those aged between 25 and 44. 30 years ago, Mr Deputy Speaker, you needed 3.2 times an average income to buy a house. Now it's 6.5 times. First home buyers are now just 1 in 7 purchases right across Australia, and investors are 50%. It's harder and harder for young people in particular to buy into the market. It's harder and harder for parents to put aside money to help their children. So we understand that, and we understand that when looking at housing affordability, we do need to look at the taxation treatment. We understand that we have the most generous taxation treatment of property investment in the world. And what we need to know is that that has an impact. Now, I had thought the government was running an outrageous scare campaign deliberately. I do have to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, after the question time performance, I'm prepared to give them a little bit of a benefit of the doubt. Maybe they just don't understand it. Because we had the Treasurer of Australia stand at that dispatch box and call negative gearing claiming deductions against investment income. Well, that is what's allowed under Labor's policy for existing properties, and that is not negative gearing. Now, if the Treasurer of Australia doesn't understand the policy, no wonder he doesn't support sensible changes to the policy. I thought he was bad, Mr Deputy Speaker, but I didn't think he was that bad. I didn't think he actually misunderstood the complete basis of the policy. Now, we know that the answer to housing affordability is to boost supply, to get more supply into the market. Now, we're not the first ones to think of this. There are many housing experts who will tell you this, but other governments have dealt with it, state governments, Labor and Liberal, because we all know about the first-home owner grants, which were introduced many years ago, have been implemented by governments of all persuasions. But state after state, Labor and Liberal, state governments have said what we need is more supply. We will only allow first-home owner grants for new housing. Has the market collapsed, Mr Deputy Speaker? No. Has there been Armageddon? Has there been a major collapse in housing prices because state governments have said we are going to focus our policy on supply, on getting more houses and apartments into the market? No, there has not. And yet here we have the alternative government making a sensible suggestion for better targeting negative gearing, putting negative gearing to work for all Australians, keeping negative gearing and saying we want to see a dividend for every single Australian from negative gearing. 93% of existing negative gearing goes into existing houses. That is a 93% failure rate if your objective is new housing construction. If we had a 93% failure rate, Mr Deputy Speaker, you'd want to review that government program. Well, we on this side of the House are up for that discussion. We on this side of the House are up for leading the debate. We on this side of the House are up for suggesting and proposing better and new policies. On that side of the House, robbed of their plan to increase the GST, they have nothing. Not the jot of an idea, not the jot of vision, not the jot of a proposal, just old-style Liberal scare campaigns. Well, the Australian people deserve better. The Australian people are looking at this Prime Minister and they are very disappointed because they hoped for better. They hoped for this Prime Minister for a bit of character, for a bit of character and a bit of honesty and a bit of hope and a bit of ticker, and instead he has given them nothing. This Prime Minister has reverted to the old-style Liberal scare campaign when robbed of his plans. It can now be truly said of this Prime Minister that his promises were, as he then was, mighty. His performance, as he now is, nothing.
Order. All this,